Little did his family know they were about to witness something that would shatter their world of disappointment forever. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Rivera family home in El Paso, Texas, casting long shadows across the breakfast table where 3 generations had shared countless meals. But this morning felt different. Heavy, the air was thick with unspoken disappointment, and the silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus Rivera, 26, sat quietly cutting his eggs, still feeling out of place in his civilian clothes after completing his third deployment to Syria just 2 weeks ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His marine dress blue uniform hung in the hallway closet like a ghost of a life his family couldn't understand. At 6 feet tall, with dark hair and the lean build of someone who'd spent years in peak physical condition, Marcus looked every inch the warrior he was. But here, in his childhood kitchen, he felt smaller than he had since basic training. His mother, Carmen Rivera, moved around the kitchen with sharp, precise movements that betrayed her frustration. A petite woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, she'd once been so proud of her youngest son. Now she wiped the counters with unnecessary force, each swipe an expression of her disappointment. His father, Roberto, a successful construction company owner whose weathered hands told the story of decades building other people's dreams, read the newspaper with exaggerated focus. The pages snapped as he turned them, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Marcus had been home for 14 days, but the homecoming he'd dreamed about during those long nights overseas had never materialized. No celebration, no pride in his service, no understanding of what he'd sacrificed. Just disappointment that seemed to hang in the air like morning fog, getting thicker with each passing day. The Rivera family had once been close. Marcus remembered Sunday barbecues where his father would beam with pride talking about his boy, Tony. The oldest had always been the golden child. Valedictorian, law school, now running a successful practice. Miguel, their cousin, had followed the expected path too, climbing the corporate ladder with determination and focus. But Marcus had chosen a different road, one his family saw as a dead end. So, his father finally said, not looking up from his paper, "Your cousin Miguel got promoted to regional manager at the bank yesterday. Youngest in company history. They're fast-tracking him for vice president." Marcus nodded politely, taking a sip of his coffee. The bitter taste matched his mood perfectly. He'd heard this comparison at least 5 times since returning home, each repetition driving the knife of disappointment deeper. "And your brother Tony," his mother added, refilling Marcus's cup without making eye contact. "His law practice is expanding again. He's opening a second office in San Antonio, maybe a third in Austin. He's talking about running for city council." "That's great, Mom. I'm really happy for Tony." And he was, genuinely. His brother deserved every success, but Marcus couldn't help wondering when his own achievements would matter to his family. Roberto folded his newspaper with deliberate precision and looked directly at his youngest son for the first time that morning. His dark eyes, so similar to Marcus's own, held a mixture of frustration and resignation. "You know what today is, Marcus? Thursday. It's the day we're going to that military ceremony at Fort Campbell, the one you insisted we attend." His father's tone carried the weight of reluctant obligation, as if Marcus had asked them to watch paint dry for 3 hours. Marcus's stomach tightened into familiar knots. The ceremony, he'd asked his parents to come weeks ago, mentioning it casually during a satellite phone call from overseas. It meant something to him, though he couldn't quite explain why to people who saw his service as an extended phase, rather than a calling. Maybe he hoped that seeing him in his dress blues, surrounded by his fellow Marines, would help them understand the path he'd chosen. Maybe he thought they'd finally see the man he'd become instead of the disappointment they believed he was. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," Marcus said quietly, though the words felt like admitting defeat. Carmen sat down heavily at the table, her coffee mug hitting the wooden surface with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the kitchen like a gunshot. "That's not the point, Mijo. The point is..." She paused, searching for words that had been building pressure like steam in a kettle for years. "The point is what, Mom?" Roberto leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of years of frustration and broken dreams. "The point is, we're ashamed of you, Marcus." The words hit like a sniper's bullet, precise and devastating. Marcus set down his fork, his appetite completely gone. The eggs on his plate suddenly looked like rubber, the toast like cardboard. Everything in the kitchen seemed to shift slightly, as if the world had tilted on its axis. "Dad, no, let me finish." Roberto's voice was steady but cutting, each word measured and deliberate. "We raised you to be something more than this. Your brothers, your cousins, they made something of themselves. Real careers, real futures, real contributions to society. And you're playing soldier, wasting the best years of your life running around foreign country." Carmen nodded in agreement, tears starting to form in her eyes like morning dew on rose petals. "We supported you when you first enlisted, thinking it would give you direction, maybe teach you some discipline. But 3 deployments, Marcus. 3 times you've chosen strangers over your family. 3 times you've risked your life for people who don't even know your name. They're not strangers, Mom. They're my brothers. Your brothers are here," she snapped, her voice cracking with emotion. "Your family is here. Your real life. But you keep running off to fight other people's wars, leaving us to worry and wonder if you're coming home in a flag-draped coffin." Marcus stood up slowly, his dress blue uniform hanging in the hallway closet seeming to mock him from a distance. Every ribbon, every medal, every symbol of his service felt hollow under his parents' disappointed gaze. "Those weren't other people's wars. I was protecting." "Protecting what?" Roberto interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "You think you're some kind of hero. You think what you're doing over there matters more than building something here, something real, something that lasts." The kitchen fell silent, except for the persistent tick of the old wall clock his grandmother had brought from Mexico 60 years ago. That clock had witnessed 3 generations of Rivera family moments, birthdays, graduations, celebrations. Now it marked time in a conversation that felt like it might tear the family apart forever. Marcus looked at his parents, really looked at them, and saw disappointment etched in every line of their faces. These were good people who'd worked their entire lives to build something better for their children. His father had started with nothing and built a construction empire. His mother had raised 3 boys while working full-time as a nurse. They'd sacrificed everything for their family's future, and in their eyes, their youngest son was throwing that future away. "Miguel makes 6 figures," his father continued, each word landing like a physical blow. "Tony's building a legacy that will last generations. And you're 26 years old with nothing to show for it except some ribbons on your chest and stories about places we'll never see." "Roberto," Carmen warned softly, but her husband wasn't finished. "We're going to this ceremony today because we said we would, because we don't break our promises. But after that it's time to grow up, get out of the military, come work with me, learn the business, stop pretending you're saving the world and start building a real life right here." Marcus felt something break inside his chest, like a dam giving way under too much pressure. These were the people who'd raised him, who'd taught him about honor and family and doing what's right. But somehow they couldn't see that his service embodied all those values they'd instilled in him. "Okay," he said quietly, the word barely above a whisper. "Okay, what? I'll come work for you. After today, I'll put in my papers." Carmen's face showed relief mixed with surprise, as if she couldn't believe their prodigal son was finally coming home. "Really? You mean it?" Marcus nodded, though his heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. "Yeah, Mom, you're right. It's time to grow up." He walked to his room with heavy steps, leaving his parents in the kitchen, probably feeling like they'd finally gotten through to their wayward son. Marcus sat on his childhood bed, surrounded by high school football trophies and old textbooks, artifacts of a simpler time when his biggest worry was passing algebra. He stared at his dress blue uniform hanging on the closet door, wondering if this would be the last time he'd ever wear it. In a few hours they'd drive to Fort Campbell for the ceremony. His parents would sit in the audience checking their watches and thinking about all the productive things they could be doing instead. They'd watch him stand with his unit, probably counting the minutes until they could leave and get back to their real lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What they didn't know, what Marcus had never told them because of military protocol and classification levels, was that today wasn't just any ceremony. Today was the day that everything they thought they knew about their disappointing son would be turned completely upside down. As he reached for his uniform with trembling hands, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message that made his heart race. Ready for today. Here, the general is looking forward to meeting your family. Time to show them what real honor looks like. Colonel Martinez. His parents thought they were ashamed of him now. In a few hours they'd discover just how catastrophically wrong they'd been about everything. The 3-hour drive to Fort Campbell, Kentucky felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. He sat in the passenger seat of his father's pristine black F-150, his dress blue uniform carefully hung in the back seat, like a condemned man's last meal. The weight of his parents' disappointment pressed down on him heavier than any combat gear he'd ever carried. Carmen sat in the back, periodically sighing and checking her phone for messages from Tony's law office, or updates about Miguel's latest promotion. Roberto drove with the radio turned to a financial news station, occasionally shaking his head at market reports or muttering about interest rates. Neither parent seemed particularly interested in the significance of where they were going or why Marcus had wanted them there. "How long is this ceremony supposed to last?" Carmen asked for the third time, her voice carrying the tone of someone enduring an unpleasant medical procedure. "A couple hours, Mom. Maybe 3. Marcus stared out the window at the Kentucky countryside rolling past. Green fields stretched toward distant hills, peaceful and serene, nothing like the harsh landscapes he'd grown accustomed to overseas. 3 hours? Roberto's eyebrows rose in the rearview mirror. What exactly do they do for 3 hours? March around and salute? Marcus felt his jaw tighten. It's an awards ceremony, Dad. They're recognizing service members for their contributions. Awards for what? Carmen leaned forward between the seats. Participation trophies. The casual dismissal of military honors stung more than Marcus expected. These were the same parents who'd driven 6 hours to watch him play high school football, who'd celebrated every touchdown and cheered for every victory, but somehow his military achievements were just participation trophies in their eyes. "It's not like that, Mom." "Then explain it to us," Roberto said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly interested in understanding. "What kind of awards? What did you do to earn them?" Marcus hesitated. The classified nature of his missions had always made it difficult to share details with his family. How could he explain the operations he'd led, the lives he'd saved, the intelligence he'd gathered without violating security protocols? How could he make them understand that their disappointing son had been handpicked for some of the most critical missions in the Syrian theater? "I can't really talk about most of it, Dad. It's classified." Roberto's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Classified? Right. Like you're some kind of secret agent." "Roberto," Carmen warned, but there was little conviction in her voice. "No, Carmen, I'm tired of the 3 deployments. And he can't tell us what he actually did. Meanwhile, Tony can explain every case he's working on, every client he's helping. Miguel can tell us about every deal he's closing, every strategy he's implementing. But Marcus? Everything's a big secret." The truck fell silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the distant chatter of financial analysts discussing quarterly earnings. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to center himself the way his team psychologist had taught him. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. It was a technique that had helped him stay calm under enemy fire, but it seemed inadequate against his parents' relentless disappointment. His phone buzzed with another text message. Marcus glanced down discreetly, careful not to let his parents see the screen. It was from Sergeant First Class Jennifer Walsh, his former team leader. "Excited to see you get what you deserve today, Rivera. Your parents are going to lose their minds, in the best possible way." Another message appeared immediately after, this one from Lieutenant Colonel Brooks. "Make sure your family stays for the reception afterward. The general specifically wants to meet them." Marcus's stomach fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He'd been keeping this secret for so long, bound by classification levels and operational security protocols, that prevented him from sharing the truth of his service with anyone outside the military community. Today, finally, his parents would understand. But would it be enough to repair the damage years of misunderstanding had caused? You know what I keep thinking about, Carmen said suddenly, breaking the silence. Remember when you were little, maybe 8 or 9, and you wanted to be a doctor? You used to play with that toy stethoscope, pretending to examine your stuffed animals. Marcus remembered. He'd been fascinated by medicine, inspired by watching his mother work as a nurse. For years he'd dreamed of following in her footsteps, maybe even becoming a surgeon. You were so focused, so determined, she continued. I used to imagine you in a white coat helping people, making a real difference in the world. He still could, Roberto added. It's not too late. He's only 26. He could go back to school, get his pre-med requirements, apply to medical school. We'd help with the costs. I am helping people, Dad. How? By carrying a gun around foreign countries, by risking your life for people who probably hate Americans anyway. Marcus bit back his initial response. How could he explain that he'd saved more lives in Syria than most doctors save in a year? How could he tell them about the medical training he'd received, the combat medic skills he'd developed, the field hospitals he'd helped establish in war zones? How could he make them understand that he'd found a way to combine his childhood dream of healing with his adult calling to serve? The people I've worked with don't hate Americans, Dad. Most of them are grateful for our help. Help doing what? Carmen pressed. What kind of help requires sending young men with guns? The frustration building in Marcus's chest felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. He wanted to tell them everything, about the village he'd helped establish clean water systems in, about the school for girls he'd helped protect from Taliban raids, about the refugee camp where he'd provided medical care to hundreds of displaced families. But operational security meant those stories had to stay classified, at least for now. You'll understand better after today, he said quietly. Roberto caught his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. Marcus, I hope you know this isn't coming from a place of anger. Your mother and I, we love you. That's why this is so hard for us. We just want to see you settled, Carmen added, reaching forward to squeeze Marcus's shoulder. We want to see you building something that lasts, something you can be proud of when you're our age. Something respectable, Roberto continued. Something that doesn't require us to worry every night that we might get a phone call telling us our son is never coming home. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He understood their fear, their concern, their desire for him to choose a safer path. But they had no idea what he'd already accomplished, what he'd already built, what he'd already proven to the people who mattered most in the military community. As they approached the gates of Fort Campbell, Marcus straightened his shoulders and checked his uniform one last time. The guard at the entrance saluted sharply when he saw Marcus's dress blues, and Roberto seemed surprised by the level of respect his son commanded even here. Wow, Carmen whispered, looking around at the impressive military installation. This place is huge. Marcus directed his father toward the main auditorium, his heart rate increasing with each passing minute. Soon, very soon, his parents would discover the truth about their disappointing son, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. As they parked and walked toward the ceremony venue, Marcus's phone buzzed one final time. This message was from a number he didn't recognize, but the words made his breath catch. Proud of you, son. Time to show your family what we've known all along. General Morrison. Marcus pocketed his phone and followed his parents toward the auditorium, knowing that in less than an hour, their world was about to be completely transformed. The Fort Campbell Auditorium was a testament to military precision and tradition. Polished marble floors reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, while burgundy curtains framed a stage, adorned with the flags of all 5 military branches. Row upon row of chairs filled the expansive space, each positioned with mathematical accuracy. The air hummed with quiet conversation, and the rustle of dress uniforms, as service members and their families took their seats. Marcus guided his parents toward their assigned section, noting how his mother's eyes widened at the grandeur of the venue. Carmen had expected something more modest, perhaps a simple base gymnasium with folding chairs and a podium. Instead, she found herself in what looked more like a concert hall or prestigious university auditorium. This, impressive, she admitted reluctantly, her voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of hundreds of conversations. Roberto nodded, though he tried to maintain his air of indifference. As a successful contractor, he'd been in his share of upscale venues, but there was something different about this place, something that commanded respect. The walls were lined with portraits of Medal of Honor recipients, their faces stern and proud, their stories of heroism captured in small brass plaques beneath each image. "How many people are they expecting?" Roberto asked, noticing that nearly every seat in the 800-capacity auditorium was filled. "It's a big ceremony," Marcus replied, deliberately vague. He spotted familiar faces throughout the crowd, family members he'd met at previous events, fellow service members from various units, and several high-ranking officers he recognized but had never personally met. The energy in the room felt electric, charged with anticipation that went far beyond a routine awards presentation. As they settled into their seats in the fifth row, Carmen noticed the caliber of people around them. To her left sat an elderly couple, the man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap and a chest full of medals on his civilian jacket. Behind them, a young woman in an army dress uniform quietly comforted what appeared to be her nervous parent. Across the aisle, a family of 7, grandparents, parents, and 3 children, all wore t-shirts with a soldier's photo printed on the front. "Daddy, when will Uncle Mike get his medal?" one of the children whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Soon, sweetheart," the father replied. "Uncle Mike did something very special for our country." Carmen glanced at Marcus, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. What exactly was this ceremony recognizing, and why did everyone else seem to know something she did? The stage began to fill with military personnel of various ranks, their uniforms crisp and movements precise. A 12-person honor guard took position at attention along the back of the stage, while a military band assembled their instruments in a side section. The American flag hung prominently at center stage, flanked by the flags of Kentucky and Fort Campbell. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced over the sound system, "please rise for the presentation of color." The entire auditorium stood as one, hundreds of voices joining in the Pledge of Allegiance followed by the national anthem. Marcus noticed his father's hand move automatically to his heart, a gesture of respect that had been ingrained since childhood. For a moment, Roberto's face softened as he looked at the flag, perhaps remembering his own father's stories of service in Korea. As they sat back down, a distinguished officer in dress blues approached the podium. The silver stars on his shoulders gleamed under the stage lights, and his chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of distinguished service. "Good afternoon, families, friends, and fellow service members," the general began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system. "I am General Patricia Morrison, and it is my distinct honor to preside over today's ceremony." Carmen felt a small jolt of recognition. She'd seen this woman on the news before, something about a high-profile military operation, or congressional testimony. This wasn't just any local base commander, this was someone important enough to appear on national television. "Today," General Morrison continued, "we gather to recognize extraordinary acts of courage, leadership, and sacrifice. The men and women we honor today have gone above and beyond the call of duty, often in circumstances that tested the very limits of human endurance and moral courage." The general's words carried weight that seemed to settle over the audience like a heavy blanket. This wasn't going to be a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony, or routine promotion announcement. Carmen found herself sitting straighter, paying closer attention. "The awards we present today represent operations conducted in some of the most challenging environments our military has faced in recent decades. Due to the sensitive nature of these missions, many details must remain classified. But what I can tell you is this: the actions of these service members have directly saved countless lives and significantly advanced our nation's security interests." Roberto shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The general's tone was making it clear that whatever was about to happen was far more significant than he'd anticipated. He glanced at Marcus, who sat perfectly still, his eyes forward, his expression unreadable. "The first award category today is the Bronze Star Medal with Combat V for Valor," General Morrison announced. "This decoration is awarded to members of the United States Armed Forces for either heroic achievement, heroic service, meritorious achievement, or meritorious service in a combat zone." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. The Bronze Star was a serious commendation, one that spoke to genuine heroism under fire. Carmen had heard of it,
but didn't fully understand its significance until she noticed the reverential quiet that had fallen over the auditorium. The second category is the Silver Star Medal, the general continued, the United States Armed Forces' third highest personal decoration for valor in combat. The Silver Star is awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Now Roberto was paying full attention. Even with his limited military knowledge, he understood that these were prestigious awards, the kind given to real heroes, not the participation trophies he'd dismissed earlier that morning. And finally, General Morrison paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the crowd. We will present the Distinguished Service Cross. This is the Army's second highest decoration for valor, awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The auditorium fell completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what they were hearing. The Distinguished Service Cross was the kind of medal that got mentioned in history books, the kind of honor that elevated ordinary soldiers into the ranks of true military legends. Marcus felt his parents' eyes on him, sensed their growing confusion and perhaps the first stirrings of realization that they might have gravely misunderstood something important. He kept his gaze forward, his military bearing intact, but inside his heart was racing, like a thoroughbred approaching the finish line. Before we begin the individual presentations, General Morrison said, I want the families here today to understand something. The men and women being honored this afternoon didn't seek recognition for their actions. They did what they did because it was right, because their fellow service members depended on them, and because innocent lives hung in the balance. She paused, scanning the audience with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to addressing crowds of thousands. Some of you may be surprised by what you learned today about your sons, daughters, husbands, wives, brothers and sisters. Due to operational security requirements, they haven't been able to share the details of their service, but today, we can finally tell their stories. Carmen's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, a nervous gesture Marcus remembered from his childhood. Roberto sat motionless, but his knuckles had turned white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. Ladies and gentlemen, General Morrison announced, let us begin with our Bronze Star recipients. As the first names were called and recipients began moving toward the stage, Marcus closed his eyes briefly and said a silent prayer. In just a few minutes his parents were about to discover that their disappointing son, the one they'd been ashamed of that very morning, was about to be honored in front of 800 people for acts of heroism they never could have imagined. The moment of truth was finally at hand.
As the first Bronze Star recipient's name echoed through the auditorium, Carmen Rivera felt her world beginning to shift on its axis. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen stepped forward with crisp military precision. His dress uniform immaculate, his bearing that of a true professional soldier. The citation that followed painted a picture of heroism that made Carmen's breath catch in her throat. For heroic achievement in ground combat against a hostile force during Operation Guardian Shield in Syria, General Morrison read, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Staff Sergeant Chen repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to evacuate wounded civilians from a contested urban area, directly saving the lives of 12 non-combatants, including 4 children. The auditorium erupted in respectful applause as Chen's family, his parents, wife, and young son beamed with pride from their seats in the front row. Carmen watched the little boy's face light up as his father received the medal, and for the first time that day, she began to understand that she might have been terribly wrong about something fundamental. That's what Marcus does, she whispered to Roberto, who was staring at the stage with an expression of growing confusion. I don't know, Roberto replied quietly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The Bronze Star presentations continued, each citation more impressive than the last. A Navy corpsman who had single-handedly treated 37 wounded soldiers during a 12-hour firefight. An Army engineer who had dismantled improvised explosive devices while under direct enemy fire, clearing safe passage for humanitarian aid convoy. A Marine scout who had provided critical intelligence that prevented a terrorist attack on a refugee camp housing 2,000 displaced families. With each story, Carmen felt the ground beneath her assumptions crumbling away. These weren't the participation trophies Roberto had mockingly described. These were acts of genuine heroism, the kind of selfless courage that defined the difference between ordinary people and true heroes. Marcus sat motionless beside them, his posture perfect, his expression revealing nothing. But Carmen noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained carefully folded in his lap, the almost imperceptible increase in his breathing rate. Her youngest son was nervous about something, and that realization sent a chill of anticipation down her spine. Our next category, General Morrison announced as the Bronze Star recipients returned to their seats, is the Silver Star Medal. These awards recognize gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, acts of courage that rise to the level of extraordinary heroism. The atmosphere in the auditorium shifted perceptibly. Even the children seemed to sense that something more significant was about to happen. Carmen noticed that several family members in their section were now sitting on the edges of their seats, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues, others holding hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. First Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, the general called, and a young woman in army dress blues stepped forward with the grace and confidence of someone accustomed to leading others into danger. The citation that followed made Carmen's heart pound. Lieutenant Martinez had led a rescue mission deep into enemy territory to extract a captured intelligence operative. Her team had fought through 3 separate ambushes, sustained heavy casualties, and still managed to complete their mission. The intelligence they recovered had prevented a coordinated terrorist attack on multiple American installations. "My God," Roberto whispered, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "These people are real heroes." Marcus turned slightly toward his father, and for just a moment, Carmen saw something flicker in her son's eyes. Not pride, exactly, but perhaps a glimmer of hope that his parents were finally beginning to understand the world he inhabited. The Silver Star presentations continued, each story more harrowing than the last. A Special Forces medic who had performed emergency surgery in a cave while enemy forces searched for his position. A helicopter pilot who had made 4 separate trips into a hot landing zone to evacuate wounded civilians, despite her aircraft taking multiple hits. A Marine squad leader who had held off an entire enemy platoon single-handedly while his wounded teammates were evacuated to safety. Carmen found herself crying without realizing when it had started. These weren't distant news stories or movie plots. These were real people sitting in the same auditorium as her family, people who had risked everything for others they'd never met. And Marcus was part of this world, part of this community of heroes that she had dismissed as playing soldier. "How did we not know?" she whispered to Roberto, who was staring at the stage with something approaching on. "Because we didn't want to listen," Roberto replied, his voice heavy with a realization that was clearly painful. "Because we thought we knew better." As the last Silver Star recipient returned to his seat, General Morrison paused, allowing the weight of what the audience had just witnessed to settle over them. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of muffled crying and the rustle of programs as people shifted in their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general said, her voice taking on an even more serious tone, "we now come to our final and most prestigious award of the day. The Distinguished Service Cross is the Army's second highest decoration for valor in combat. It is awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." Carmen felt Marcus tense beside her, a subtle change that only a mother would notice. Her heart began to race as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed started falling into place. "The mission I am about to describe," General Morrison continued, "remained classified until just last week. What I can tell you now is that it represented one of the most successful special operations missions conducted in the Syrian theater, directly resulting in the dismantling of a major terrorist cell and the prevention of what intelligence officials believe would have been the deadliest attack on American soil since September 11th. The auditorium fell silent as a tomb. Even the youngest children seemed to understand they were hearing something of profound importance. This mission required extraordinary courage, exceptional leadership, and a level of tactical brilliance that impressed even our most experienced special operations commander. The individual being honored today led a team deep into enemy territory, maintained operational security under extreme duress, and completed objectives that military analysts had deemed nearly impossible. Carmen's hands were shaking now. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw her son as if for the first time, the quiet confidence she'd always attributed to stubbornness, the physical conditioning she'd thought was just vanity, the way other service members in the auditorium had nodded respectfully when they'd seen him earlier. "The soldier we honor today," General Morrison said, her voice rising with unmistakable pride, "exemplifies everything we hope to achieve in our Special Operations Forces: intelligence, courage, leadership, and an unwavering commitment to protecting innocent life." Roberto reached over and gripped Carmen's hand, both of them staring at their son with a mixture of growing realization and absolute terror at what they were about to discover. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium, "for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, for leadership under fire that saved countless American lives, and for tactical excellence that serves as a model for future special operations." Marcus stood up slowly, his movement fluid and precise, years of military training evident in every gesture. Carmen's hand flew to her mouth as she watched her disappointing son step into the aisle and begin walking toward the stage. The Distinguished Service Cross is awarded to Staff Sergeant Marcus Antonio Rivera, United States Marine Corps. The auditorium erupted in thunderous applause, but Carmen Rivera heard none of it. She sat frozen in her seat, watching her youngest son, the one she'd called a disappointment that very morning, walk toward the stage to receive one of the highest military honors in existence. Everything she thought she knew about her son had just been revealed as a lie, and the truth was more extraordinary than anything she could have imagined. Carmen Rivera's world collapsed and rebuilt itself in the span of 3 seconds. The thunderous applause around her sounded muffled and distant, as if she were underwater. Her youngest son, the one she'd called a disappointment over breakfast, the one she'd begged to quit the military and get a real job, was walking toward the stage to receive one of the most prestigious military honors in existence. "That's our son," she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. "That's Marcus." Roberto sat motionless beside her, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his chair with such force that his knuckles had turned bone white. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The successful businessman who always had an opinion about everything found himself completely speechless, for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Around them, 800 people rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the auditorium. Carmen forced herself to stand on unsteady legs, her vision blurred by tears she couldn't control. Through the haze, she watched her son approach the stage with the confident stride of someone completely at home in this moment, someone who belonged in this place among these heroes. "How did we not see it?" Roberto finally managed to croak out, his voice thick with emotion. "How did we miss all of this?" Marcus reached the stage and came to attention before General Morrison, his salute crisp and precise. Even from their seats, Carmen could see the respect in the general's eyes as she returned the salute. This wasn't a perfunctory ceremony or routine presentation. This was a moment of genuine recognition between warriors who understood what Marcus had accomplished. "The citation," General Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "reads as follows. Staff Sergeant Rivera distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism while serving as team leader of a classified special operations mission in Syria on March 5th. Carmen's legs gave out and she collapsed back into her seat, Roberto's arm instinctively moving to support her. March 15th. She remembered that date because Marcus had called home 2 days later, his voice sounding strained and exhausted. When she'd asked if everything was okay, he'd simply said he'd had a rough few days and changed the subject. Now she was learning that those rough few days had involved extraordinary heroism. When intelligence indicated that a high-value terrorist target was planning an imminent attack on American civilians, Staff Sergeant Rivera volunteered to lead a 6-man team deep into enemy-controlled territory, the general continued. The mission parameters were considered so dangerous that it was classified as a probable one-way operation. A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. Carmen felt the blood drain from her face as the full implication hit her. Her son had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. While she'd been complaining about him missing family dinners, he'd been risking his life to prevent terrorist attacks. Despite encountering overwhelming enemy resistance, Staff Sergeant Rivera successfully infiltrated the target compound. When his team came under heavy fire and sustained multiple casualties, He personally carried 2 wounded team members to safety while maintaining tactical command of the operation. Roberto was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he listened to a story about courage that redefined his understanding of heroism. This wasn't the plot of an action movie or a news report about distant events. This was his son, the boy he'd taught to ride a bicycle, the young man he'd dismissed as irresponsible and directionless. Under intense enemy fire, Staff Sergeant Rivera then returned to the compound alone to complete the primary objective. The intelligence he recovered led directly to the capture of 12 high-value targets and the prevention of a coordinated terrorist attack that would have resulted in massive civilian casualties on American soil. The words hit Carmen like physical blows. Her son had gone back after saving his wounded teammates. After completing what should have been impossible, he'd gone back alone into enemy fire to finish the mission. The courage required for such an act was beyond her comprehension. Staff Sergeant Rivera's extraordinary heroism, selfless service, and tactical brilliance reflect the highest traditions of military service and bring great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Marine Corps, General Morrison concluded. As the general lifted the Distinguished Service Cross from its presentation case, Carmen noticed that her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The medal was beautiful in its simplicity, a bronze cross suspended from a blue and white ribbon, but she now understood that it represented something far more significant than its physical appearance suggested. General Morrison approached Marcus, who stood at perfect attention. "Staff Sergeant Rivera," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that transcended the formality of the ceremony, "it is my distinct honor to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds." As the general pinned the medal to Marcus's chest, Carmen saw something she'd never noticed before in her son's bearing. This wasn't the posture of someone playing soldier or seeking adventure. This was the stance of a man who had been tested in the crucible of combat and emerged as a proven leader, someone others trusted with their lives. The general stepped back and saluted Marcus sharply. Marcus returned the salute, and then something happened that made Carmen's heart nearly stop beating. General Morrison extended her hand, and instead of a formal handshake, she pulled Marcus into what could only be described as an embrace between family members. "Your parents have no idea how proud they should be," the general said, her words picked up by the microphone and broadcast to the entire auditorium. "But they're about to find out." As Marcus turned to face the audience, his eyes found his parents immediately. The expression on his face wasn't one of triumph or vindication. Instead, Carmen saw something that broke her heart completely: hope. Despite everything they'd said that morning, despite years of disappointment and criticism, her son was looking at them with hope that they might finally understand. Roberto stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. Without thinking, without caring about protocol or proper ceremony etiquette, he began to clap. Not the polite applause of a distant observer, but the thunderous, desperate clapping of a father who had just discovered that his son was a hero. Carmen joined him, her own applause echoing through the auditorium, as she sobbed openly. Around them, other families were clapping and cheering, but she only had eyes for Marcus, her son, her hero, the young man she'd been ashamed of just hours earlier. As the applause gradually died down and Marcus began walking back toward his seat, Carmen realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The son she thought she knew had never really existed. The real Marcus, the one walking toward them now with a medal for extraordinary heroism on his chest, was someone she was only just beginning to meet, and she had a lifetime of apologies to make. The post-ceremony reception was held in Fort Campbell's prestigious Officers Club, a venue that under normal circumstances would have impressed Carmen Rivera with its polished hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of military leaders throughout history. But nothing about this day could be considered normal anymore. She moved through the elegantly appointed rooms in a daze, her mind still reeling from the revelation that had shattered every assumption she'd held about her youngest son. Marcus stood near the far wall, surrounded by what appeared to be a small crowd of admirers. Carmen watched from across the room as officers of various ranks approached him with handshakes and congratulations. These weren't casual pleasantries exchanged at a routine military function. These were genuine expressions of respect between professionals who understood the significance of what Marcus had accomplished. "I can't believe this is real," Roberto murmured beside her,
his voice still thick with emotion. He held a glass of champagne that he'd barely touched, his attention focused entirely on observing their son in this environment. Look at how they treat him, Carmen. Look at the respect he commands. Carmen nodded, unable to trust her voice. Every few minutes, someone new would approach Marcus, a colonel wanting to shake his hand, a sergeant major offering congratulations, a group of younger Marines who looked at him with something approaching reverence. Her son accepted each interaction with the same quiet grace she'd always seen in him, but now she understood it wasn't shyness or social awkwardness. It was the measured confidence of someone accustomed to leadership and responsibility. Mr. and Mrs. Rivera. A voice behind them made them both turn. A distinguished-looking officer in dress blues approached with an extended hand. I'm Colonel Martinez. I had the honor of serving with your son in Syria. Roberto shook the colonel's hand with something approaching reverence. Colonel, we had no idea. Marcus never told us about any of this. Colonel Martinez smiled, though there was a slight edge to his expression. That doesn't surprise me, sir. Marcus is one of the most humble soldiers I've ever commanded, but I have to tell you what he did over there. It was extraordinary, even by special operations standards. Carmen found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. We thought he was we didn't understand what he was really doing. Ma'am, with all due respect, Colonel Martinez said, his tone polite but pointed, your son has been protecting people like you and me for years. The missions he's completed, the lives he's saved, both American and civilian, represent the very best of what our military can accomplish. The colonel's words weren't accusatory, but Carmen felt their weight nonetheless. While she'd been complaining about Marcus's choice of career, he'd been literally saving lives and preventing terrorist attacks. While she'd been pressuring him to quit and get a real job, he'd been doing work that most people couldn't even imagine, let alone accomplish. Colonel, Roberto said, his voice gaining strength, can you tell us more about what Marcus did? We want to understand. Colonel Martinez glanced across the room at Marcus, who was now in conversation with General Morrison herself. What I can tell you is that your son volunteered for a mission that other special operations veterans called impossible. When his team was pinned down and taking casualties, he didn't just complete the primary objective, he went above and beyond to ensure every one of his teammates made it home alive. Carmen felt tears threatening again. He went back alone? Yes, after evacuating his wounded teammates, he returned to enemy territory by himself to complete the mission. The intelligence he recovered prevented what our analysts believe would have been the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil since. The colonel paused, letting the significance of his words sink in. Your son is quite literally a hero, Mrs. Rivera. As Colonel Martinez excused himself to join another conversation, Carmen and Roberto stood in stunned silence. Around them, the reception continued with the gentle hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft strains of military band music. But for the Rivera parents, the world had narrowed to a single overwhelming realization. They had been catastrophically wrong about everything. We have to talk to him, Carmen said suddenly, her voice urgent with desperation. We have to apologize, explain, make this right somehow. Roberto nodded, but his expression was troubled. What do we say, Carmen? Sorry, we thought you were a disappointment when you were actually saving the country. How do we come back from this morning? Before Carmen could answer, she noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the room. General Morrison herself was walking directly toward them, her expression serious, but not unkind. Carmen felt her heart rate spike as the most powerful person in the room stopped directly in front of them. Mr. and Mrs. Rivera, the general said, extending her hand. I'm General Morris. I wanted to personally thank you for raising such an exceptional young man. Carmen shook the general's hand with trembling fingers. General, this morning you had concerns about your son's military career. General Morrison finished gently. I understand many military families struggle with the uncertainty and danger that comes with service, especially at Marcus's level of operations. Roberto stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion. General, we were wrong, completely wrong. We told him we were ashamed of him, that he was wasting his life. We had no idea what he was really doing. General Morrison's expression softened slightly. Mr. Rivera, the classified nature of your son's work meant he couldn't share details with anyone outside the military community. That's not his fault, it's a necessary part of operational security. But we should have trusted him, Carmen said, her voice breaking. We should have believed in him instead of comparing him to his brothers, instead of pressuring him to quit. Miss Rivera, the general said, her tone taking on the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. What matters now is what you do going forward. Your son loves you both deeply. He talks about his family constantly. But I won't lie to you. The conversation you had this morning hurt him more than any enemy fire he's ever faced. The words hit Carmen like physical blows. The idea that their criticism had wounded Marcus more than actual combat was almost unbearable to contemplate. What can we do? Roberto asked desperately. How do we fix this? General Morrison looked across the room at Marcus, who was now surrounded by an even larger group of admirers. You start by understanding that your son doesn't need your permission to be proud of his service. He doesn't need your approval to know his worth. What he needs is your support for the man he's already become. As the general prepared to move on to other conversations, she turned back to them one final time. Your son is considering leaving the military because he thinks it will make you proud of him. I hope you'll convince him otherwise. Men like Marcus Rivera are rare, and our country needs them. With that, General Morrison walked away, leaving Carmen and Roberto standing alone with the crushing weight of their mistakes, and the desperate need to somehow make things right with the son they'd never really known at all.
The reception continued around them, but Carmen and Roberto Rivera existed in a bubble of mounting dread and self-recrimination. Every laugh from across the room, every handshake Marcus received, every respectful nod from passing officers served as another reminder of how spectacularly they had misjudged their youngest son. The weight of their ignorance pressed down on them like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe in the elegant confines of the officers' club. We need to approach him, Carmen said for the third time in 10 minutes, but her feet remained rooted to the polished hardwood floor. Each time she'd started to move toward Marcus, she'd been overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she needed to say and how inadequate any apology would be. Roberto watched their son from across the room, noting details he'd never paid attention to before. The way other Marines stood a little straighter when Marcus spoke to them, the genuine warmth in General Morrison's eyes when she looked at him, the respectful distance other officers maintained while still clearly wanting to be part of his conversation. This wasn't the behavior of people humoring a disappointing young man playing soldier. This was the behavior of people in the presence of genuine heroism. Look at him, Carmen, Roberto said, his voice thick with regret. Really look at him. He carries himself like a leader because he is one. How did we miss that? How did we look at our own son and see failure where everyone else sees excellence? A young Marine approached their position, his dress blues immaculate and his bearing respectful but confident. Excuse me, are you Staff Sergeant Rivera's parent? Carmen nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. I'm Lance Corporal Thompson, ma'am. I served under your son in Syria. The young man's voice carried a reverence that made Carmen's heart ache. I just wanted to thank you for raising such an incredible leader. Staff Sergeant Rivera saved my life during that mission. Roberto felt his knees weaken. What? Yes, sir. I was one of the Marines he carried to safety after we were hit. He could have completed the mission and left us, but he came back for everyone. Lance Corporal Thompson's eyes grew distant as he recalled the memory. Most of us wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for your son's courage. Carmen's hand flew to her throat as the full impact of the young Marine's words hit her. This wasn't a story from a citation or a formal ceremony. This was a living, breathing human being whose life had been saved by her son's actions. A young man who would go home to his own family because Marcus had risked everything to bring him back. We had no idea, she whispered. Lance Corporal Thompson looked confused. Sir? Ma'am, you didn't know about the mission? We didn't know about any of it. Roberto admitted, the shame evident in his voice. We didn't understand what Marcus was really doing over there. The young Marine's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching shock. With respect, sir, your son is a legend in special operations circles. What he accomplished in Syria, it's the kind of thing they'll teach in military academies for decades. As Lance Corporal Thompson excused himself and moved on, Carmen and Roberto were left to confront an even more uncomfortable truth. Not only had they been wrong about Marcus's service, but their ignorance was apparently so complete that it shocked even junior enlisted personnel. "We have to face this," Carmen said, suddenly, her voice gaining strength for the first time all day. "We have to walk over there and admit what we did wrong." Roberto nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "What if he doesn't forgive us? What if we've damaged this relationship beyond repair?" Before Carmen could answer, they were approached by another officer, this one a grizzled master sergeant with multiple combat deployments evident in his bearing and the ribbons on his chest. "You folks must be the Riveras," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Master Sergeant Williams, I've heard a lot about you from Marcus." Carmen shook his hand hesitantly. "What? What has he said?" Master Sergeant Williams smiled, but there was something sad in his expression. "He talks about you all the time, ma'am. How proud he is of his family, how much he wants to make you happy. Kid's been carrying around guilt for years because he thinks he's let you down somehow." Roberto felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Guilt? Yes, sir. Marcus has always felt like he disappointed you by choosing military service over civilian careers. He's been considering putting in his papers for months, trying to figure out how to transition to something you'd approve of." The words hit Carmen like a physical assault. While they'd been criticizing Marcus for wasting his life, he'd been feeling guilty about disappointing them. While they'd been comparing him unfavorably to his brothers, he'd been questioning his own worth and considering abandoning a career where he was clearly exceptional. "We never wanted him to feel guilty," Carmen said, tears streaming down her face. "We just didn't understand." Master Sergeant Williams nodded sympathetically. "Ma'am, with respect, it's not about understanding every detail of what he does. It's about trusting that the man you raised has the judgment to make good decisions about his own life." As the Master Sergeant moved on to other conversations, Carmen and Roberto found themselves facing the most uncomfortable truth of all. Their lack of support hadn't just hurt Marcus emotionally, it had potentially deprived the military and the country of one of its most capable leaders. "He's going to quit because of us," Roberto said, the realization hitting him like a sledgehammer. "The most decorated soldier in this room is going to leave the service because his parents made him feel like a failure." Carmen watched Marcus across the room, now engaged in an animated conversation with a group of younger Marines, who were clearly hanging on his every word. This wasn't the scene of a man wasting his life or playing at being a soldier. This was a natural leader in his element, surrounded by people who respected and admired him. "Not if we can help it," she said firmly, her maternal instincts finally overriding her shame and uncertainty. "We're going to fix this, Roberto. We're going to tell him the truth about how wrong we were, and we're going to make sure he knows that we're proud of him." Roberto nodded, drawing strength from his wife's determination. Carmen looked at her son one more time, noting the easy confidence with which he moved through this world, the genuine respect he commanded from people whose opinions clearly mattered. Then at least he'll know that his parents finally understand who he really is. As they began walking toward Marcus, Carmen realized that this conversation would be the most important of their lives, not just for their relationship with their son, but for Marcus's future and potentially for all the lives he might save if he remained in the military. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but it was also exactly the motivation they needed to finally do what they should have done years ago: trust their son's judgment and support his choices unconditionally. The time for half measures and conditional love was over. Now they had to prove they were worthy of the hero they'd raised. Each step across the polished floor of the officers' club felt like walking through quicksand. Carmen and Roberto Rivera moved toward their son with the heavy inevitability of people approaching their own judgment. Around them, the reception continued with its gentle buzz of conversation and clinking glasses. But for the parents, the world had narrowed to a single terrifying focus: the conversation that would either heal their family or destroy it forever. Marcus stood with his back partially toward them, engaged in conversation with a small group that included 2 colonels and a Navy commander. Carmen could hear fragments of their discussion, something about tactical innovations and leadership development programs. Her son was speaking with the easy confidence of someone whose opinions were valued and respected, whose insights were sought after by senior officers from multiple branches of the military. "He looks so natural here," Roberto whispered, his voice filled with wonder and regret. "Like he belongs with these people more than he ever belonged at our dinner table." Carmen nodded, unable to speak. Watching Marcus in this environment was like seeing him for the first time. The quiet intensity she'd always attributed to moodiness was actually the focused attention of a professional soldier. The physical conditioning she'd thought was vanity was the necessary preparation of someone whose life, and the lives of others, depended on peak performance. The respectful distance he sometimes maintained at family gatherings wasn't antisocial behavior. It was the natural reserve of someone accustomed to carrying classified information and life-or-death responsibility. As they drew closer, one of the colonels noticed their approach and said something quietly to Marcus. Their son turned, and for a moment, Carmen saw something flicker across his face, a brief vulnerability that disappeared almost immediately behind his professional mask. "Mom, Dad," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral, "I was wondering when you'd come over." The group of officers began to disperse with practiced military courtesy, sensing a family moment in the making. "We'll catch up later, Marcus," one of the colonels said, clasping him briefly on the shoulder. "Outstanding ceremony today." Suddenly Carmen and Roberto found themselves alone with their son in a small pocket of space amid the crowded reception. The weight of everything that needed to be said pressed down on them like a physical force. Marcus stood at ease, his posture perfect, his expression politely expectant, but Carmen could see the tension in his jaw, the slight stiffness in his shoulders that suggested he was preparing himself for another difficult conversation. "Marcus," Carmen began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of any words she might use. "How do you apologize for fundamentally misunderstanding someone's entire life? How do you ask forgiveness for years of subtle undermining and overt criticism?" "It's okay, Mom," Marcus said quietly, and the gentle understanding in his voice nearly broke her heart. "I know this is all a lot to take in. I know it's not what you expected." Roberto stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "Son, we need to talk about this morning, about what we said to you." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew distant. "Dad, I meant what I said. If you want me to get out, I'll put in my papers. I can probably be discharged within 6 months and start working with you by the fall." "No," Carmen said, the word coming out more forcefully than she'd intended. Several nearby conversations paused momentarily before resuming. "No, Marcus, that's not what we want." Marcus looked genuinely confused. "But this morning you said." "This morning we were idiots," Roberto interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "This morning we didn't understand what we were talking about." For the first time since they'd approached, Marcus's professional composure cracked slightly. "I don't understand." Carmen looked around the room, at the officers who'd spoken to her about Marcus's heroism, at the young Marines whose lives he'd saved, at the general who'd embraced him like family. "Marcus, we didn't know. We had no idea what you were really doing, what you'd accomplished, what kind of man you'd become." "The Distinguished Service Cross," Roberto said, his voice growing stronger. "Marcus, do you understand what that means? Do you understand that we watched our son, the one we thought was wasting his life, receive one of the highest military honors in existence?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his natural humility making him uncomfortable with the praise. "It was just doing my job, Dad." "No," Carmen said firmly, "it wasn't just doing your job. Lance Corporal Thompson told us you saved his life. Colonel Martinez told us you prevented a terrorist attack. General Morrison told us you're considering leaving the military because you think it will make us proud." At this, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "She told you that?" "Son," Roberto said, stepping closer, "we've been the worst kind of fools. We've been judging your choices based on our own fears and limitations, not on your capabilities and call." Carmen watched her son's face carefully, seeing the wariness there, the protection he'd built up against years of subtle disappointment. "Marcus, when we said we were ashamed of you this morning, we were wrong, completely catastrophically wrong. You don't have to." Marcus began. "Yes, we do," Roberto interrupted. "We have to tell you that we're sorry. We have to tell you that we're proud of you. And we have to tell you that if you leave the military because of what we said, we'll never forgive ourselves." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between his parents' faces as if trying to determine whether this was real or some kind of elaborate ceremony-induced emotion that would fade by tomorrow morning. I've been carrying this guilt for years, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the reception noise. Feeling like I was letting you down, like I should be doing something else with my life. Carmen felt tears starting again. Oh baby, no, we let you down. We should have been supporting you, trusting you, celebrating your achievements instead of comparing them to other people's completely different lives. The work you do matters, Roberto added, his voice gaining conviction. The lives you save matter. The courage you show matters. And if we were too blind and selfish to see that before today, that's our failure, not yours. Marcus looked around the room, taking in the scene of his fellow service members and their families, the atmosphere of honor and respect that surrounded them all. When he looked back at his parents, Carmen saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. Hope. So you don't want me to get out? He asked quietly. God. No, Carmen said emphatically. We want you to stay in. We want you to keep doing what you're obviously meant to do. We want you to keep being the hero we never knew we'd raised. For the first time all day, Marcus smiled. Not the polite, professional smile he'd been wearing, but the genuine, unguarded smile she remembered from his childhood. I was really scared you'd never understand, he admitted. Roberto reached out and pulled his son into a fierce embrace. We understand now, son, and we're so damn proud of you. We can barely stand it. As Carmen joined the embrace, she realized that this moment, standing in a room full of heroes, holding her son who was the greatest hero of all, was the real ceremony. This was where their family began again. The embrace lasted longer than any hug the Rivera family had shared in years, and when they finally separated, something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. The invisible wall that had been building for months, constructed from misunderstanding, disappointment, and failed communication, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. But as the immediate emotions subsided, Carmen and Roberto began to grasp the full magnitude of what they were learning about their son's life. Marcus, Carmen said, her voice still thick with tears, I need to understand something. When you called home after that mission in March, you sounded exhausted, but you just said you'd had a rough few days. You nearly died, saving people, and you called it a rough few days. Marcus glanced around the reception, noting that several conversations had paused as other families noticed the emotional scene playing out. He guided his parents toward a quieter corner near a display of military artifacts, where they could talk without becoming a spectacle. Mom, I couldn't tell you the details, not because I didn't want to, but because operational security meant I literally wasn't allowed to discuss it with anyone outside the military community. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Even now there are aspects of that mission that will remain classified for years. Roberto struggled to process this information. So all those times we thought you were being secretive or distant, you were actually following orders? In part, yes, but also. Marcus hesitated, then seemed to make a decision to be completely honest. Also because I knew you wouldn't understand. I knew that if I told you I'd spent 3 days in enemy territory with no backup, or that I'd been in firefights where people were trying to kill me, you'd just worry more and pressure me even harder to get out. Carmen felt a fresh wave of guilt crash over her. So you protected us from the truth because you knew we couldn't handle it. I protected you because I love you, Marcus corrected gently. But yes, I also knew that the more you understood about what I actually do, the more you'd want me to stop doing it. The irony wasn't lost on Roberto. Their son had been shielding them from his heroism while they criticized him for what they perceived as his failures. Marcus, what else don't we know? What else have you accomplished that we never heard about? Marcus looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Dad, it's not about accomplishments, it's about doing what needs to be done, son, Roberto said firmly. Humor me, your mother and I need to understand the full scope of how wrong we've been. After a moment's consideration, Marcus spoke quietly. There have been 4 missions in the last 2 years where my team was specifically requested by name. 3 of them involved hostage rescue operations. 1 prevented what intelligence analysts believe would have been a coordinated attack on American schools. Carmen's hand flew to her mouth. Schools? The intelligence we gathered led to the arrest of a cell that had been planning simultaneous attacks on elementary schools in 3 different states. They had weapons, they had detailed plans,
and they had chosen their targets specifically because they wanted to maximize casualties among children. The weight of this revelation hit Carmen like a physical blow. While she'd been complaining about Marcus missing family dinners, he'd been preventing the massacre of innocent children. While she'd been pressuring him to pursue a normal career, he'd been doing work that literally saved lives on a massive scale. How many people? Roberto asked quietly. How many lives have you saved? Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable with the question. Dad, that's not how we think about it. You don't keep score, but if you had to estimate, Carmen pressed. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly reluctant to engage in what felt like boasting. The missions I've been directly involved in have prevented casualties that could have numbered in the thousands, but that's not counting the intelligence that gets passed along to other units, or the long-term effects of disrupting terrorist networks. Roberto felt overwhelmed by the scope of his son's impact. Thousands of people are alive today because of work you've done. Thousands of people are alive because of work my teams have done, Marcus corrected. I'm just one part of a larger operation. Carmen looked around the reception room with new eyes. Every person in military uniform, every family celebrating their service members' achievements. They were all part of something much larger than she'd ever understood. And her son wasn't just a participant in this community, he was clearly a leader within it. The other Marines, she said slowly, the ones who talk to you with such respect, they look at you the way we should have been looking at you all along. Marcus nodded. Military communities understand each other in ways that civilian families sometimes can't. That's not anyone's fault, it's just the nature of the work. But it is our fault, Roberto said firmly, because we could have made the effort to understand. We could have asked questions instead of making assumptions. We could have trusted your judgment instead of imposing our own limited perspective. Before Marcus could respond, General Morrison approached their small group. I hope I'm not interrupting a family moment, she said with a warm smile. Not at all, General, Carmen said quickly. We were just learning about our son's actual career for the first time. General Morrison's smile widened. Mrs. Rivera, your son is being considered for promotion to gunnery sergeant ahead of schedule. He's also been selected to attend the Advanced Infantry Officer course, which typically leads to assignments in strategic planning and special operations development. Carmen felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost overwhelming. He's being promoted. More than that, the general continued, Marcus is being groomed for leadership positions that will shape the future of special operations. His tactical innovations from the Syria mission are already being incorporated into training programs for other units. Roberto looked at his son with something approaching awe. You're going to be training other special operations soldiers? It's just one possibility, Dad, Marcus said, clearly embarrassed by the attention. It's considerably more than that, General Morrison corrected. Your son represents the future of American special operations. The combination of tactical brilliance, leadership ability, and moral courage he's demonstrated is exactly what we need in our senior rank. As the general moved on to other conversations, Carmen and Roberto found themselves staring at their son with a mixture of pride, regret, and overwhelming love. We almost lost you, Carmen said quietly. If we'd kept pushing, if you'd actually quit to make us happy, the military would have lost someone irreplaceable. Marcus reached out and took both his parents' hands. But you didn't lose me, and now you understand. That's what matters. Roberto squeezed his son's hand. What matters is making sure you never doubt our support again. What matters is making sure you know that we're proud of the man you've become, and the work you're doing. Looking around the room one more time, Carmen realized that this reception wasn't just celebrating today's award recipient. It was celebrating a way of life, a commitment to service, and a level of sacrifice that she was only beginning to comprehend. And her son wasn't just part of this world, he was helping to lead it into the future. The conversation that had started with shame and disappointment had transformed into something entirely different, the beginning of a new relationship built on understanding, respect, and unconditional support for the hero they'd finally learned to see.
The 3-hour drive back to El Paso was nothing like the tense journey that morning. Roberto drove while Carmen sat in the passenger seat, both of them stealing glances at Marcus in the rearview mirror. Their son sat in the back, still wearing his dress blues with the Distinguished Service Cross, now prominently displayed on his chest, looking out the window at the same Kentucky countryside that had passed by in silence just hours earlier. But everything had changed. I keep thinking about what Colonel Martinez said. Carmen broke the comfortable silence. About how you're known in special operations circles. Marcus, are you famous? I mean within the military. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Not famous, Mom. Respected, maybe. The special operations community is pretty small. Word gets around when someone does good work. Good work, Roberto repeated, shaking his head in amazement. Son, preventing terrorist attacks and saving lives isn't just good work, it's extraordinary work. Through the rearview mirror, Roberto watched his son's face. There was something different about Marcus now, not in his demeanor or bearing, which had always been confident, but in the way he related to his parents. The defensive walls had come down. The careful distance he'd maintained during family conversations had disappeared. For the first time in years, he seemed completely relaxed in their presence. Can I ask you something? Carmen turned in her seat to look at Marcus direct. When you were growing up, when you used to play with my stethoscope and talk about being a doctor, was any part of you thinking about the military even then? Marcus considered the question carefully. I think I was always drawn to helping people in crisis situations. I used to have these dreams about being the person who could save everyone when things went wrong. The military just turned out to be where I could actually do that. You found your calling, Roberto said simply. I guess I did, but it took me a long time to stop feeling guilty about it not being the calling you and Mom wanted for me. Carmen felt a fresh pang of regret. Marcus, I need you to understand something. When we compared you to Tony and Miguel, when we pushed you toward civilian careers, it wasn't because we didn't love you. It was because we were scared. Scared of what? Scared of losing you. Roberto answered. Scared of getting a phone call in the middle of the night telling us our son was never coming home. We thought if we could convince you to choose something safer, something more predictable, we could protect you from that risk. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. But you understand now that some risks are worth taking? We understand now that trying to protect you from your calling was actually the most dangerous thing we could do, Carmen said. Not dangerous to your body, but dangerous to your spirit, dangerous to who you're meant to be. As they crossed from Kentucky into Tennessee, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled, the first completely unguarded smile his parents had seen from him in months. Good news? Roberto. My team leader wants to get together next week to discuss my next assignment. Looks like I'll be staying in special operations for the foreseeable future. Good, Carmen said firmly. That's exactly where you belong. The landscape rolled by as they continued south, and Roberto found himself thinking about the conversation they'd had that morning in their kitchen. It felt like it had happened to different people, in a different lifetime. The parents who had told their son they were ashamed of him seemed like strangers now. Marcus, he said suddenly, I need to ask you to forgive us, not just for this morning, but for years of not seeing you clearly, for years of making you feel like you had to justify your choices to us. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Roberto interrupted. Because you deserve parents who believe in you completely, who trust your judgment, who celebrate your achievements instead of comparing them to other people's completely different lives. Carmen nodded vigorously. From now on, we want to hear about your work. Whatever you're allowed to share, we want to understand your world better, and we want you to know that we're proud of you. Not despite your military service, but because of. Marcus leaned forward between the seats, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy they remembered from years ago. Really? Really? Carmen said, reaching back to squeeze his hand. We're proud of your courage, your leadership, your commitment to protecting others. We're proud that when you saw injustice in the world, you decided to do something about it instead of just complaining from the sidelines. As they entered Tennessee, Roberto made a decision. Marcus, I want to do something. I want to host a barbecue for your unit when you get back from your next assignment. I want to meet the people you serve with, the people who understand what you do. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. You want to meet my team? I want to thank them, Roberto correct. I want to thank them for serving alongside you, for having your back, for being the family that supported you when we didn't know how. Carmen felt tears threatening again. But these were different tears, tears of gratitude and pride instead of regret and shame. And I want to send care packages to your unit. Real care packages, with things you actually need, not just the random stuff I used to send because I felt obligated. Mom, you don't have to do that. I want to do it. I want to support all of you, not just my son. As they crossed into Arkansas, the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Marcus watched the sunset through the window and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with his family relationships. There's something else, he said quietly. General Morrison mentioned that there might be opportunities for me to speak at military academies, to share tactical lessons learned from recent operations. That's incredible, Carmen said. Our son, teaching the next generation of military leaders. Would you come to one of those speeches? Marcus asked. Would you want to see me in that environment? Roberto met his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. Marcus, we'd be honored to attend anything you're involved in. We want to be part of your world now, not separate from. As they drove through the Arkansas countryside, the Rivera family began planning a future that looked completely different from the one they'd imagined that morning. There would be military events to attend, care packages to send, teammates to meet, and achievements to celebrate. Most importantly, there would be a son who no longer had to carry the weight of his parents' disappointment, and parents who finally understood the extraordinary nature of the man they'd raised. The GPS indicated they still had 4 hours of driving ahead of them, but for the first time all day, no one was in a hurry to reach their destination. This journey, both literal and metaphorical, had become the most important trip the Rivera family had ever taken together. And when they finally pulled into their driveway in El Paso, they would be coming home as a completely different family than the one that had left that morning. A family united in pride, understanding, and unconditional love for the hero they'd almost lost, because they'd been too afraid to see who he really was. The familiar sight of their El Paso neighborhood looked different somehow, as Roberto turned onto their street. The same adobe houses with their red tile roofs, the same desert landscaping, the same mountain silhouette against the evening sky. Everything was exactly as they'd left it that morning, but the Rivera family viewing it had been fundamentally transformed. As they pulled into the driveway, Carmen noticed their neighbor Mrs. Gutierrez watering her garden next door. The elderly woman waved, and Carmen found herself wondering what Miss Gutierrez would think if she knew that the quiet young man next door, the one she'd watched grow up, the one she occasionally worried was going nowhere with his life, had just received one of the nation's highest military honors. Home, Marcus said simply as Roberto turned off the engine. But it was more than that. This was the first time Marcus had come home to parents who truly understood who he was, and what he represented. No more walking on eggshells around conversations about his career, no more carefully avoiding details about his work, no more carrying the weight of their disappointment, alongside the responsibility of protecting innocent lives. Inside the house, Carmen immediately went to the kitchen, the same kitchen where their devastating conversation had taken place just 12 hours early. The coffee cups from breakfast were still in the sink, a tangible reminder of how much had changed since morning. She began clearing them with new purpose, as if washing away the remnants of their old family dynamic. I want to call Tony and Miguel, she announced suddenly. I want to tell them about today. Marcus looked uncertain. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Carmen interrupted. For years I've been using your brothers as examples of success, making you feel like you didn't measure up. But they need to know what their little brother has actually accomplished. They need to know that they have a genuine American hero in the family. Roberto nodded emphatically. Your mother's right, son. Your brothers should be looking up to you, not the other way around. As Carmen reached for her phone, Marcus gently caught her hand. Can we wait until tomorrow? Tonight, I just want to be with you two. I want to enjoy having parents who finally understand. The simple request nearly broke Carmen's heart. How many times had Marcus come home from deployments, from training exercises, from ceremonies like today's, wanting nothing more than to share his experiences with his family? How many times had they been too focused on their own expectations to truly listen? Of course, she said softly. Tonight is just for us. Roberto opened the refrigerator and pulled out 3 beers, handing one to Marcus and one to Carmen. I think we should make a toast. They stood in the kitchen where the day had begun so badly, 3 bottles raised in the warm light of the setting sun streaming through the window. To Marcus, Roberto said, his voice thick with emotion, for being brave enough to follow his calling even when his parents were too blind to see its value. To our son, Carmen added, for protecting people like us while we complained about him not being enough like everyone else. Marcus looked at his parents, really looked at them, and saw something he'd been hoping to see for years: genuine pride, complete acceptance, and unconditional love for exactly who he was. To family, he said simply, and to finally understanding each other. As they clinked bottles and drank, Carmen noticed the Distinguished Service Cross, still pinned to Marcus's dress blue uniform. The metal caught the kitchen light, its simple bronze design somehow radiating the extraordinary courage it represented. Marcus, she said quietly, I want you to know that from now on when people ask me about my children, I'm going to tell them about my oldest son the lawyer, my nephew the banker, and my youngest son the war hero. Mom, no false modesty, Roberto interrupted. That's exactly what you are. And it's time your parents started acting like we understand that. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. Carmen glanced at the caller ID and saw Tony's name. She looked at Marcus questioningly. Go ahead and answer it, Marcus said, but maybe don't mention the ceremony yet. I'm not ready for the whole family to know everything. Carmen answered the phone, her voice still emotional from their conversation. Tony, Mom, are you okay? You sound like you've been crying. Carmen looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Tony, I'm fine, better than fine actually. We just got back from Fort Campbell. Fort Campbell? Why were you at a military base? We attended a ceremony honoring your brother. Carmen's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Tony, Marcus received Distinguished Service Cross today. Do you know what that is? There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, Mom, that's one of the highest military honors in existence. Are you serious? Dead serious? Your little brother is a genuine war hero, Tony. He saved lives, prevented terrorist attacks, and today he was recognized for extraordinary heroism. Carmen could hear the shock in Tony's voice. I had no idea. Marcus never said anything about. He couldn't tell us the details because of classification levels, Roberto called out, loud enough for Tony to hear. But today we learned that our son has been protecting this country in ways we never imagined. Can I talk to him? Tony asked. Carmen handed the phone to Marcus, who took it somewhat reluctantly. Hey, Tony. Marcus, man, I don't know what to say. The Distinguished Service Cross? That's incredible. Thanks, Tony. It was a team effort though. I just happened to be the one they put in for the award. Carmen watched her son deflect praise with typical humility, but she noticed something different in his posture. He wasn't minimizing his achievements out of shame or insecurity anymore. He was simply being genuinely modest about extraordinary accomplishment. Listen, Tony continued, I owe you an apology. We all do. Mom and Dad have been holding you up to these civilian standards, and I've been part of that. But what you're doing, it's more important than anything the rest of us have accomplished. Marcus looked surprised. Tony, you don't need to. Yes, I do. You're protecting people, Marcus. Real people, real families. I help corporations navigate legal issues. You prevent terrorists from killing children. There's no comparison. As Marcus continued his conversation with Tony, Carmen and Roberto exchanged glances filled with hope. This was just the beginning. Word would spread through their extended family, their community, their circle of friends. Everyone would learn that the Rivera family's youngest son wasn't the disappointment they'd thought he was. He was the hero they'd been too blind to see. When Marcus finally hung up the phone, he looked at his parents with an expression of wonder. Tony wants to bring his kids to meet me next weekend. He said he wants them to know their uncle is a real hero. Carmen felt tears starting again. The good kind, the proud kind. That's exactly what should happen. Your nieces and nephews should know who you really are. As the evening settled around them, the Rivera family began the process of rebuilding their relationships on a foundation of truth, understanding, and mutual respect. The kitchen that had witnessed years of subtle disappointment and overt criticism was now filled with something it had been missing for far too long: a family who truly saw and celebrated each other for exactly who they were. The sacred boundary that had been crossed that morning, the fundamental disrespect for Marcus's calling and sacrifice, had been not just restored, but transformed into something stronger, From now on his service wouldn't be tolerated or endured by his family, it would be on. Over the next 3 days, word of Marcus's distinguished service cross spread through El Paso like wildfire. Carmen had called her sister Rosa first, then her mother, then seemingly half the neighborhood. Each conversation followed the same pattern: shock, disbelief, and then overwhelming pride. By Thursday morning, the Rivera family had received more phone calls, text messages, and impromptu visits than they'd had in the previous 6 months combined. Roberto sat at his kitchen table scrolling through Facebook posts that Carmen had insisted he read. Their story had somehow made its way onto social media, shared by friends and family members who wanted the world to know about Marcus's heroism. The local newspaper had even called, asking for an interview about El Paso's hometown hero. "Listen to this," Roberto said, reading from his phone. "This is from your cousin Maria. I always knew Marcus was special, but I had no idea he was this special. The Rivera family should be so proud." She shared it with 200 people. Carmen looked up from her own phone where she was responding to a flood of congratulatory messages. "Roberto, look at this comment from Mrs. Gutierrez next door. She says she's been watching Marcus for years, wondering why he seemed so mature and responsible compared to other young men his age. She says now it all makes sense." The attention was overwhelming but also validating in a way that surprised both parents. For years they'd felt embarrassed by what they perceived as their son's lack of direction. Now they were discovering that other people had seen qualities in Marcus that they'd been blind to: the quiet confidence, the physical fitness, the respectful demeanor, the way he carried himself with dignity and purpose. Marcus himself seemed both amused and slightly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. He'd returned to base on Wednesday for his regular duties, but even there, word of his parents' revelation had spread. His commanding officer had called to congratulate him not on the medal, which the military community had already celebrated, but on finally having family support that matched his achievement. "Mom," Marcus said during their nightly phone call Thursday evening, "Colonel Martinez wants to know if you and Dad would be interested in attending the Marine Corps ball next month as my guests." Carmen nearly dropped the phone. "The Marine Corps ball? Is that important?" "It's one of the most formal military events of the year. It's where we celebrate Marine Corps history and honor our traditions. I've never brought family before, because," he trailed off, "because you knew we wouldn't understand its significance." Carmen finished quiet. "But we do now, don't we?" "You do now," Marcus agreed, and Carmen could hear the smile in his voice. As word continued to spread, the responses became increasingly emotional. Miguel called from San Antonio, his voice thick with tears as he apologized for ever making Marcus feel inferior about his career choice. Childhood friends reached out, sharing memories of Marcus's character and leadership qualities that they'd noticed even in high school. Teachers from his old school posted on social media about how proud they were of their former student, but perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source: Roberto's business partners. "Carmen," Roberto called from the living room Friday morning, "you need to hear this." His business partner Jim Crawford was on speakerphone, his voice carrying an emotion Roberto had never heard before. "Roberto, I've been thinking about what you told me about Marcus, and I need to share something with you." "What's that, Jim?" "My son Danny served in Afghanistan. He came home with PTSD, struggling to readjust, feeling like nobody understood what he'd been through. Last year he was at some kind of veteran support group, and there was a Marine there, a staff sergeant who was leading a discussion about coping with combat stress." Roberto felt his heart start to race. "Jim, Danny came home that night more positive than I'd seen him since his deployment. He kept talking about this Marine who'd helped him understand that his experiences mattered, that his service had value." "Roberto, that Marine was your son?" Carmen sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this revelation. Marcus had been helping other veterans process their trauma, and he'd never mentioned it to them. "Danny's doing great now," Jim continued. "He's back in school, he's engaged to a wonderful girl, he's got his life on track." And according to him, a big part of that turnaround started with a conversation with Marcus Rivera. After Jim hung up, Roberto and Carmen sat in stunned silence. Not only had their son been saving lives overseas and preventing terrorist attacks, but he'd been helping wounded veterans heal and rebuild their lives right here at home. "How many other stories are there?" Carmen asked quietly. "How many other lives has he touched that we don't even know of?" Roberto shook his head in amazement. "And we thought he was wasting his life." The phone rang again. It had been ringing almost constantly for 3 days.
This time it was Father Miguel from their church, San Antonio Catholic Church, where the Rivera family had attended services for over 20 years. "Carmen," Father Miguel said, his voice warm with affection, "I've been hearing wonderful things about Marcus. I wonder if you'd allow me to recognize him during Sunday Mass. I think our congregation would be inspired to hear about one of our own receiving such a prestigious honor." Carmen looked at Roberto, who nodded enthusiastically. "Father, I think Marcus would be honored, but maybe we should ask him first." "Of course, but Carmen, I want you to know, I've watched that boy grow up in our parish. Even as a teenager, there was something special about him, a sense of purpose, a maturity that you don't often see. I always wondered where life would take him." After hanging up with Father Miguel, Carmen realized that this cascade of recognition and support wasn't just about Marcus's recent medal. It was about people finally being able to express what they'd always seen in him but had never felt comfortable saying when his own parents seemed disappointed in his choices. "Roberto," she said slowly, "what if we weren't the only ones who misjudged him? What if there are other military families going through what we went through, parents who don't understand their children's service, who are pressuring them to quit, who are making them feel guilty for following their calling?" Roberto looked thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking maybe we have a responsibility to share our story, to help other families avoid making the mistakes we made." As if on cue, Carmen's phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Rivera, my name is Janet Martin. My daughter just enlisted in the army and I'm terrified I'm going to lose her. I heard about your story from a friend. Could we talk?" Carmen showed the message to Roberto, who read it twice before meeting her eyes. "It's already starting, isn't it? Other families reaching out for help." Carmen nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Their painful journey from ignorance to understanding, from disappointment to pride, could serve as a roadmap for other families struggling with similar challenges. But first they needed to continue healing their own family, and that process would begin in earnest on Sunday, when their entire church community would hear the truth about Marcus Rivera, not just the war hero, but the young man who'd been quietly making a difference in countless lives, while his own parents had been too blind to see it. The revelation that had started with a ceremony was becoming something much larger, a community-wide recognition of a hero who had been hiding in plain sight for years.
Sunday morning at San Antonio Catholic Church had never felt quite like this. Carmen Rivera sat in the third pew, the same spot where the Rivera family had gathered for over 2 decades. But everything was different now. Word had spread through the congregation about Marcus's Distinguished Service Cross, and Carmen could feel the respectful glances and warm smiles from parishioners who had watched her son grow up in this very church. Marcus sat between his parents, wearing his dress blue uniform at Father Miguel's request. The sight of him in full military regalia in their family church created a powerful connection between his two worlds, the sacred space where his character had been formed, and the military community where that character had been tested and proven. "I'm nervous," Carmen whispered to Roberto as the service began. "Why?" Roberto asked, though he understood completely. This was the first time they would publicly celebrate their son's achievements, the first time they would stand before their community and acknowledge what Marcus had accomplished. "Because for years when people asked about our children, I focused on Tony's law practice and Miguel's banking career. I never really talked about Marcus's service with pride. Now everyone will know how wrong I was." Marcus overheard and leaned toward his mother. "Mom, you don't have anything to be embarrassed about, you just didn't understand. Now you do. That's what matters." As Father Miguel began the service, Carmen noticed how many people kept glancing in their direction, not with judgment, but with genuine interest and respect. Miss Hernandez from down the street gave her a thumbs up. The Rodriguez family, whose son was considering military enlistment, looked at Marcus with obvious admiration. When it came time for announcements, Father Miguel's voice took on a special warmth. "My dear congregation, Today we have the privilege of recognizing one of our own who has brought great honor to our parish family. The church fell completely silent, all attention focused on the altar. Many of you have watched Marcus Rivera grow up in this church. You've seen him serve as an altar boy, participate in youth group, and mature into a fine young man. What you may not have known is that Marcus has spent the last several years serving our country with extraordinary distinction. Carmen felt her heart pounding as Father Miguel continued. Last week, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera received Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest decoration for valor in combat. This medal is awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. A murmur of amazement rippled through the congregation. Carmen heard someone whisper, "That's incredible," from behind them. But more than his individual heroism, Father Miguel continued, Marcus represents something we should all aspire to. The courage to follow your calling even when it's difficult, even when others don't understand, even when the path forward isn't clear. Carmen felt tears starting as the priest's words echoed her own recent realizations. Marcus has saved lives, prevented terrorist attacks, and served our nation with the same dedication and moral courage that we try to instill in all our young people. But perhaps most importantly, he has done all of this while remaining humble, compassionate, and committed to helping others. Father Miguel paused, looking directly at the Rivera family. I've had the privilege of counseling many military families over the years, and I know that military service can be challenging not just for those who serve, but for their families as well. The Rivera family's journey to understanding and supporting Marcus's calling is a testament to the power of love, communication, and the willingness to see our children for who they truly are, not who we expect them to be. Now Roberto was crying too, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement of their family's transformation. Marcus, Father Miguel said, would you please stand so our congregation can properly honor you? Marcus rose slowly, his military bearing evident even in the church pew. The entire congregation erupted in applause that seemed to echo off the vaulted ceiling. Carmen watched through her tears as people she'd known for decades stood to honor her son, their faces showing genuine pride and respect. But what moved her most was watching Marcus himself. Instead of the uncomfortable embarrassment she might have expected, she saw quiet dignity and gracious acceptance. This was a man comfortable with recognition because he'd earned it through genuine service to others. As the applause died down and Marcus sat back down, Father Miguel concluded his remarks. Let us all remember Marcus's example of courage, service, and dedication. And let us support all our military families with the understanding and love they deserve. After the service, the Rivera family was surrounded by well-wishers. Parents of other service members approached to share their own stories. Veterans from previous generations came forward to shake Marcus's hand and welcome him to their brotherhood. Young people asked questions about military service, clearly inspired by Marcus's example. But the conversation that affected Carmen most deeply came from Maria Santos, a woman whose son had been struggling with direction after high school. Carmen, Maria said, pulling her aside, I need to apologize. For months I've been pushing my son to be more like Tony, or Miguel, successful in traditional ways. But watching your family's story unfold, seeing how Marcus has found his calling in service, I think I need to listen better to what my son actually wants to do with his life. Carmen gripped Maria's hand. That's exactly what we learned. Sometimes the path our children choose isn't the one we would have picked. But that doesn't make it wrong. As they walked toward their car after the service, Carmen noticed that several young people had approached Marcus with serious questions about military service. He was speaking with them patiently and honestly, neither glorifying nor minimizing the challenges and rewards of military life. Look at that, Roberto said, pointing to the group around Marcus. He's inspiring the next generation. Carmen nodded, realizing that their son's influence extended far beyond his military achievement. He was becoming a role model for young people in their community, an example of what it looked like to pursue your calling with dedication and integrity. As they drove home, Carmen reflected on how completely their world had changed. A week ago she'd been ashamed of her son's career choice. Now she was watching him inspire others to consider military service as a noble calling. Roberto, she said as they pulled into their driveway. I think we need to do more than just support Marcus. I think we need to become advocates for military families in our community. Roberto nodded thoughtfully. What did you have in mind? I keep thinking about that text from Janet Martinez, the mother whose daughter just enlisted. What if we started a support group for military families? What if we helped other parents understand what we've learned? As they walked into their house, Carmen realized that their journey from shame to pride had become something larger than personal transformation. It had become a mission to help other families avoid the mistakes they'd made, and to ensure that no other military service member had to endure what Marcus had endured. The pain of feeling unsupported by the people who should have loved them unconditionally. Their son had always been a hero. Now they were finally ready to become the parents a hero deserved. 3 weeks after the church service, the Rivera family home had been transformed into an unofficial headquarters for military family support in El Paso. The dining room table, which once hosted awkward family dinners filled with comparisons and disappointment, now served as a meeting space for parents, spouses, and siblings trying to understand and support their military family member. Carmen sat across from Janet Martinez, the mother who had first reached out via text message. Janet's daughter Elena had been in Army basic training for 6 weeks, and Janet was struggling with everything from fear for her daughter's safety to guilt about not understanding Elena's motivation for enlisting. I keep thinking I failed as a mother, Janet said, her voice thick with emotion. Elena was supposed to go to college, maybe become a teacher like I always wanted to be. Instead, she's crawling through mud with a rifle, and I don't understand why she chose that. Carmen reached across the table and squeezed Janet's hand. Janet, I said almost those exact words about Marcus 3 weeks ago. I thought his military service meant I had failed as a parent, because he wasn't following the path I had planned for him. Roberto, who was setting up chairs for the evening support group meeting, paused in his work. The hardest thing for us to accept was that Marcus knew himself better than we knew him. He understood his calling better than we understood our own son. Through the window they could see Marcus in the backyard, setting up a barbecue grill for the military family gathering they were hosting that evening. He'd driven down from base specifically for this event, bringing with him 3 other Marines, whose families were struggling with similar issues. Look at him, Carmen said, gesturing toward the window. 6 months ago I looked at that same young man and saw disappointment. Now I see exactly what he's always been. A leader, a protector, someone who makes everything around him better. Janet followed Carmen's gaze and watched Marcus efficiently organizing the outdoor space, while simultaneously helping one of his fellow Marines practice a phone conversation with his estranged parents. Elena talks about him. She heard about his Distinguished Service Cross through military channels. She says he's becoming legendary among the younger Marines. Carmen felt the familiar surge of pride that had become a daily experience. We're still learning about all the ways Marcus has been making a difference. Every week, someone new tells us a story about how he's helped them or their family member. The front door opened and Father Miguel entered carrying a box of his homemade tamales for the evening gathering. Over the past 3 weeks he had become a regular supporter of the Rivera family's informal military family ministry. Carmen, Roberto, he greeted them warmly. How many families are we expecting tonight? Roberto consulted his notebook, a sign of how organized their support efforts had become. 12 families, Father. We have parents of Marines, Army soldiers, Navy sailors, and Air Force airmen. Some are dealing with deployment anxiety, others with homecoming adjustment issues, and a few are struggling with children who want to enlist against their parents' wishes. Father Miguel nodded approvingly. And Marcus's fellow Marine, 3 of them drove down specifically to share their perspectives, Carmen explained. Marcus thought it would help for parents to hear directly from other service members about why they chose military life and what it means to them. As the afternoon progressed, families began arriving for what had become a monthly gathering. Carmen watched each arrival with growing amazement at how much her life had changed. Mrs. Chen, whose son was considering Marine officer candidates, the Rodriguez family, whose daughter was deploying to overseas duty for the first time, the Williams family, whose son had been struggling with PTSD since returning from Afghanistan. Each family carried their own version of the story Carmen knew so well. Love mixed with fear, pride complicated by misunderstanding, support undermined by worry and preconceived notions about what constituted success. But what amazed Carmen most was watching Marcus interact with the other parent. The same young man who had once sat quietly through family dinners, absorbing criticism and disappointment, now moved confidently through conversations about military culture, deployment realities, and the support systems that helped families thrive rather than merely survive military life. Miss Rivera called Sarah Williams, whose son Jake had been Marcus's patient in that veteran support group. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Carmen stepped aside with Sarah, noting the woman's emotional expression. "I need to thank you for what your family is doing here." Sarah began. "Jake came home from his first meeting here 3 weeks ago and said it was the first time in months that he felt like our family understood what he'd been through." Carmen shook her head. "Sarah, we're not doing anything special. We're just trying to help other families avoid the mistakes we made." "But that's exactly what makes it special," Sarah insisted. "You're taking your own painful experience and using it to help others." Jake says, "Marcus treats every veteran like family, and now I understand where that comes from. He learned it from parents who figured out how to love unconditionally." As the evening gathering began in earnest, Carmen found herself facilitating a discussion between parents about the difference between supporting their children's choices and enabling poor decisions. The conversation was complex, sometimes heated, but always respectful, a tone that Marcus helped set through his patient explanations and gentle corrections of misconceptions about military life. Roberto stood at the edge of the group watching his wife lead a conversation about military family dynamics with authority and compassion. 6 months ago, Carmen had been demanding that Marcus leave the military to pursue a real career. Now she was helping other parents understand why military service was among the most real and meaningful careers their children could choose. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, appearing beside Roberto, "thank you for doing this, for opening your home, for making other families feel welcome." Roberto put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Marcus, this isn't us doing something for you, this is us finally doing what we should have been doing all along, supporting not just our own military family member, but our entire military community." As the evening wound down and families began saying their goodbyes, Carmen noticed something remarkable happening. Parents were exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet for coffee, creating their own support networks beyond the monthly gathering. What had started as her family's attempt to make amends for their own failures was becoming something larger, a genuine community of military families, supporting each other through the unique challenges and extraordinary rewards of military life. Janet Martinez approached Carmen one final time before leaving. "Alina calls me tomorrow for her weekly check-in, for the first time since she enlisted. I'm actually excited to hear about her training, to ask questions about her experiences instead of trying to talk her out of her choices." Carmen hugged Janet warmly. "That's exactly how it should be. Your daughter chose military service for good reasons. Trust her judgment, support her choices, and celebrate her achievement." As the last families departed and Marcus prepared to drive back to base, Carmen realized that their family's transformation had created something beautiful and lasting. They had built a bridge between civilian families and military culture, helping parents understand that their children's service was something to be proud of, not endure. The shame and disappointment that had once filled their home had been replaced by purpose, community, and the deep satisfaction that comes from turning personal growth into service to others. Justice, Carmen realized, wasn't just about making things right with Mark. It was about ensuring that other military families never had to experience the pain and misunderstanding that had nearly destroyed their own relationship. 1 year later, Carmen Rivera stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once told her son she was ashamed of him, reading a letter that would forever change how she understood the ripple effects of love, support, and second chance. The letter had arrived that morning, addressed to the Rivera family, Military Family Support Network, El Paso, Texas. The return address showed it came from a military base in North Carolina, but the sender's name was unfamiliar: Captain Elena Martinez. As Carmen read, her hands began to tremble. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Rivera, you don't know me, but your family saved my life. Not in the way your son Marcus saves lives overseas, but in a way that was just as important to me. My name is Elena Martinez. My mother Janet attended your support group meetings when I was in basic training. You probably remember her. She was the mother who thought she had failed because her daughter chose military service over college. What you don't know is that I was ready to quit." The letters from home were filled with disappointment and fear. My mother's phone calls always ended with her begging me to come home and pursue something safer. I felt like I was breaking my family's heart by following my calling. Then something changed. Mom started attending your meetings, and suddenly her letters were different. Instead of disappointment, I heard pride. Instead of fear, I heard understanding. Instead of pressure to quit, I heard encouragement to excel. Miss Rivera, that change in my mother's support literally saved my military career. I graduated at the top of my training class, earned my commission as a second lieutenant, and last month I was promoted to captain ahead of schedule. But here's what will amaze you. Last week I led a mission that rescued 12 American hostages from a terrorist compound in Syria. The skills I learned, the confidence I developed, the leadership abilities I honed, all of that happened because your family helped my mother understand that my choice to serve was something to be celebrated, not endured. Those 12 Americans are alive today because your family helped heal the relationship between a mother and daughter. Those 12 families got their loved ones back because you took your own painful experience and used it to help others. I wanted you to know that your son Marcus wasn't the only hero in your family. By learning to support him unconditionally, by helping other families do the same, you became heroes too. With infinite gratitude and respect, Captain Elena Martinez, United States Army. My mother frames your family photo on her mantle now, right next to my military portraits. She tells everyone who visits that you taught her how to be proud of her daughter's service. Carmen sank into a kitchen chair, the letter clutched in her shaking hand. Roberto found her there, 20 minutes later, tears streaming down her face. "Carmen? What's wrong?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. As Roberto read, his own eyes filled with tears. When he finished, he looked at his wife with an expression of wonder. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly. Carmen nodded, unable to speak. Their journey from shame to support, their decision to help other military families, their choice to turn their mistakes into a ministry, it had literally saved lives. Not just Elena's life and career, but the lives of 12 American hostages, who came home because a confident, well-supported officer had led their rescue mission. The phone rang, interrupting their emotional moment. It was Marcus calling from base as he did every Sunday morning. "Morning, Mom. How are you and Dad doing?" "Marcus," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion, "we just received a letter that I need to read to you." As she read Elena's letter aloud, Carmen could hear the amazement in her son's silence. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Mom," he finally said, "do you remember what you told me that morning, a year ago? You said you were ashamed of me." Carmen felt her heart break all over again. "Marcus, I will regret those words for the rest of my life." "No, Mom, you're missing the point. You said you were ashamed of me, but look what happened. Your willingness to admit you were wrong, to change, to help other families, it led to 12 Americans coming home alive." Sometimes our biggest mistakes become our greatest opportunities to make a difference. Roberto took the phone. "Son, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Mom's shame became Elena's salvation. Our family's pain became other families' healing. Dad, I'm prouder of what you and Mom have built this past year than I am of any medal I've ever received." As the conversation continued, Carmen realized that their story had come full circle in the most beautiful way possible. The shame that had once threatened to destroy their family had been transformed into a force that literally saved lives across the globe. That evening, as the monthly military family support meeting convened in their dining room, Carmen looked around at the faces gathered there, parents who now celebrated their children's service,
spouses who understood the importance of their partner's mission, siblings who bragged about their military family members instead of worrying about them. Janet Martinez was there, glowing with pride as she shared Elena's promotion and heroic mission with the group. Other parents shared their own good news: children thriving in military careers, families healing from years of misunderstanding, young people inspired to serve because they knew they had their family's support. As the meeting concluded, and families began to leave, Father Miguel approached Carmen with a thoughtful expression. "Carmen," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about Elena's letter all day. Do you realize what you've created here?" Carmen looked confused. "What do you mean, Father?" "You've created a living example of one of the most important truths in human experience, that our greatest failures can become our greatest gifts to others, if we have the courage to be honest about our mistakes, and the wisdom to use them for good." As the last families departed and Carmen began cleaning up, she reflected on Father Miguel's words. A year ago, she had been a mother ashamed of her son's heroism. Tonight she was a woman who had helped create a network of support that stretched across the country, and literally saved lives. Marcus arrived home late that evening, having driven down from base to surprise his parents. As the three of them sat in their kitchen, the sight of so much pain and transformation, Marcus pulled out his phone. "I have something to show you," he said, opening his email. "This came through military channels today." He showed them a message from General Morrison, Staff Sergeant Rivera. "I wanted you to know that Captain Martinez's mission report specifically mentioned the confidence and leadership skills she attributed to strong family support during her early career. Her success reflects not just her own capabilities, but the power of unconditional family backing. Your parents' military family support network has been recognized at the Pentagon level. We're implementing similar programs at bases nationwide. Your family's transformation from misunderstanding to advocacy is becoming a model for military-family relations across all service branches. You should be proud of your parents, Sergeant Rivera. They're making a difference that extends far beyond anything any of us could have imagined." Respectfully, General Patricia Morrison. As Carmen finished reading, she looked at her son and husband with tears of joy streaming down her face. Their kitchen table, which had once been the site of crushing disappointment and harsh words, had become the command center for a movement that was changing military families across America. "Marcus," she said softly, "when I told you I was ashamed of you that morning, I was the one who should have been ashamed. You were already a hero. I just needed to become the mother a hero deserved." Marcus reached across the table and took both his parents' hands. "Mom, Dad, you didn't just become the parents I deserved, you became the parents that hundreds of military families needed. You turned your pain into their healing, your mistakes into their hope." As the Rivera family sat together in their transformed kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of lives changed and relationships healed, Carmen realized that their story contained a truth that could change anyone's life. Sometimes the very thing we're most ashamed of becomes the foundation for our greatest contribution to the world. Sometimes our deepest failures prepare us to offer our most meaningful help to others, and sometimes the courage to admit we were wrong and change our hearts creates ripple effects that reach farther than we ever dared to imagine. The parents who had once been ashamed of their war hero son had become heroes themselves, not through medals or recognition, but through the simple, powerful act of choosing love over fear, understanding over judgment, and service over self-protection. And in a world that desperately needs more heroes, that choice made all the difference.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.